The house was quiet except for the soft sound of footsteps and the faint ticking of a clock. Grandma sat in her favorite armchair, her white hair slightly messy, wearing a pink shirt that had seen better days. She was tired and weak, the sickness making every movement painful. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes looked tired but still kind. The black father named James was busy in the kitchen. His black hair was a little messy from running his hands through it in worry, and he wore a simple gray shirt. James had been taking care of Grandma since she fell ill a few days ago. Every morning he made sure she had her medicine on time and prepared soft meals that she could eat without trouble. He cleaned the house and checked on her constantly, always patient and gentle. On the other side of the room, the white son, named David, was sitting on the couch. His black hair was neat, and he wore a white shirt. He watched James with a frown on his face. David didn't understand why his dad was doing so much for Grandma. He sometimes whispered to himself, "Why is he even still here?" David felt like James wasn't truly part of the family, even though he had been around for years. James knew David was unhappy, but he didn't say anything. His focus was on Grandma. He lifted a small bowl of soup and carefully brought it to her. Grandma tried to smile but coughed softly instead. James helped her sit up a little, making sure she was comfortable. "Here, Grandma. Try a little," James said softly. Grandma nodded and took a few spoonfuls. It was hard for her, but she trusted James. He had always been kind to her. David looked away, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. He thought James shouldn't be doing all of this. To him, James was just a visitor, not someone who should be this involved. "I'll get the doctor," James said, reaching for his phone. Grandma needed a checkup, and James wanted to make sure she was getting the best care. David stood up suddenly. "Why do you even care so much? She's not your family," he said sharply. James paused but kept his voice calm. "Family isn't just about blood, David. It's about love and respect. Grandma needs help, and I'm here for her." David didn't answer. He walked out of the room, leaving James and Grandma alone. The days that followed were full of care from James. He cleaned the house, took Grandma to the doctor, and stayed by her side through the long nights. Sometimes David would watch from a distance, unsure how to feel. One evening, James sat next to Grandma, holding her hand gently. "You're strong, Grandma. We'll get through this," he said softly. Grandma squeezed his hand weakly. "Thank you, James. You're a good man." James smiled, but inside he wished David could see how much he truly cared. As night fell, the house was calm again. James checked on Grandma one last time before resting. The weight of the unspoken tension with David was heavy, but James knew he had to keep going for Grandma's sake. This was only the beginning of a difficult journey, but James was ready to face it, no matter what anyone else thought. The days passed slowly in the quiet house. James was still taking care of Grandma every moment he could. He made sure she took her medicine, helped her move around, and kept the house clean. Despite his tiredness, he never complained. His focus was on Grandma's health. David, the white son, grew more uncomfortable each day. He watched James closely, noticing how much time and energy James gave to Grandma. Instead of feeling grateful, David's thoughts became colder. He started to question James in front of others. One afternoon, while James was helping Grandma into her chair, David said loudly, "Why do you even bother? She's old and sick. You could spend your time somewhere else." His voice was sharp, and everyone in the room stopped. James looked at David calmly. "Because she is family," he said. "She deserves care and respect." David shook his head. "You're not really family. You're just here because of Mom. You don't belong." James said nothing. He finished helping Grandma sit comfortably and went to the kitchen to get her some water. The words stung, but he kept his patience. Later that day, Grandma looked at David with tired eyes. "Why are you so hard on James?" she asked softly. David avoided her gaze. "I don't know, it just feels wrong." Grandma reached out and held David's hand. "James has been good to me. Sometimes family isn't only about blood." David pulled his hand away gently. He wasn't ready to accept that yet. James spent most evenings sitting quietly near Grandma's bed. He knew the son's attitude was a problem, but he wanted to focus on healing. He hoped that over time David would change. One evening, David was alone in the living room when James entered with a tray of food. "I made something for you," James said softly. David looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because family takes care of each other," James replied with a small smile. David looked away. "I don't know if I can believe that." James didn't push. He placed the food down and left the room quietly. The tension grew heavier, but so did James's determination. He knew that words wouldn't change David overnight, but actions might. At night, when the house was still, James often thought about how to fix the broken connection. He wished David could see beyond his anger and understand the love behind James's care. Meanwhile, Grandma's health was slowly improving. The doctors said she was stronger, but she still needed help every day. One afternoon, David saw James helping Grandma walk to the garden. The way James held her hand, steady and kind, was different from how David had imagined him. For a moment, David felt confused. Maybe James wasn't just a visitor after all. The silence between David and James stayed, but small cracks were beginning to show. James hoped this was the start of something better. The house felt colder these days, not because of the weather, but because of the silence between David and James. The tension was visible to everyone, even Grandma. She noticed how David avoided James and how James tried his best to keep the peace. One afternoon, James was helping Grandma get ready to sit outside in the garden. Grandma loved the fresh air, and James knew it lifted her spirits. As he gently helped her put on a light jacket, David walked into the room. He stopped, watching quietly. "Can you do that for me?" David asked, nodding toward the chair outside. James looked up, surprised, but nodded. He walked to get the chair while David followed slowly. Outside, the sun was warm, and the garden smelled like fresh flowers. Grandma smiled softly as James helped her sit down. David stood nearby but kept his distance. "Thanks, James," Grandma said quietly. James smiled but didn't say much. He was used to these moments of quiet appreciation. David shifted uncomfortably. Finally, he spoke. "Why do you stay so calm with me, after everything I say?" James sat down beside Grandma and looked at David. "Because I care about this family. I want us all to be okay, even if it's hard right now." David looked away, feeling confused. He had many feelings inside: anger, jealousy, sadness. He didn't know how to handle them. Over the next few days, David watched James care for Grandma in ways he hadn't noticed before. James stayed up late when Grandma had trouble sleeping. He called the doctor when she felt worse, even if it was the middle of the night. He cooked food just the way Grandma liked. These small things made David think. Maybe James was more than just the other man in the house. One evening, David saw James sitting on the couch, tired but still alert. Grandma was asleep nearby. David hesitated but sat down across from James. "How do you do it?" David asked quietly. "Taking care of her even when it's so hard." James smiled softly. "Because she needs someone, and because family is about being there when it matters." David didn't answer. He looked at James with new respect but also sadness. He wished things were different between them. The next day, David tried to help. He offered to get Grandma some water and even helped James carry a small bag of groceries. It was awkward, but it was a start. Grandma noticed and smiled. "See, David? We can all help," she said gently. The small acts of kindness slowly began to melt the coldness in the house. It wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. James hoped this new change would continue. He wanted the family to heal, not just for Grandma's sake, but for all of them. Even David seemed to want that now, though he didn't say it out loud. The house still had its problems, but the walls were no longer closing in. They were learning how to live together with care and respect. The house was quieter than usual. Grandma was resting, and James was preparing a small meal in the kitchen. The smell of soup filled the air. David sat at the table, watching James work. The silence between them was heavy but different now, not tense like before, but uncertain. David finally spoke. "James, why do you keep helping her? Why do you stay here so much?" James stopped what he was doing and looked at David. His eyes were calm. "Because she needs me," he said simply, "and because I want to be part of this family." David frowned, still unsure. "But you're not really part of the family. You're not my dad." James didn't get angry. Instead, he walked over and sat next to David. Family isn't always about blood. It's about who's there when it counts. David looked away, thinking. He wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Later, Grandma called for James. She needed help sitting up. James helped her carefully, supporting her weak body. David watched quietly. After a few minutes, David surprised himself by saying, "Let me help." James smiled softly. "Thank you, David." They worked together to make Grandma comfortable. The small teamwork was a step forward. That night, David couldn't stop thinking about James's words. Maybe family was more than what he believed. Maybe James's care was real. The next morning, David found James in the living room. He hesitated, then said, "I want to understand better. I want to be part of this too." James looked surprised but happy. That means a lot. As days went by, David tried to be more helpful. He asked questions about Grandma's medicine and even cooked a simple meal once. James noticed and appreciated the effort. One afternoon, David and James were outside with Grandma. She smiled at both of them, feeling the warmth in the air. "See," Grandma said softly, "we are family." David nodded slowly. He was still learning but wanted to believe. James felt hope growing. He knew it would take time, but the walls were coming down. He decided to keep being patient and kind, no matter what. The house felt a little lighter now, filled with quiet moments of understanding. It was a new beginning for all of them. The days grew warmer, and Grandma's health slowly improved. James continued to care for her with the same patience and love. He never missed a medicine dose, and he always made sure she was comfortable. David watched all of this, feeling a mix of emotions he still couldn't fully understand. One afternoon, James helped Grandma to the living room. She looked tired but peaceful. James gently placed a blanket over her knees and sat down beside her. David was nearby, scrolling through his phone but glancing up now and then. Suddenly, Grandma looked at David. "Come here," she said softly. David put down his phone and moved closer. "What is it, Grandma?" She smiled weakly. "You've been quiet lately. I see you watching James. What do you think?" David hesitated. "I don't know. At first, I didn't want him here. I thought he didn't belong. But now, I see how much he cares." Grandma nodded. Sometimes the heart knows things the mind doesn't understand yet. James smiled from his seat. It takes time for trust to grow. David looked at James and said quietly, "Thank you for everything you've done." James shook his head. "No need to thank me. Family helps each other." That evening, David thought a lot about his own feelings. He realized he had been unfair to James. The man wasn't just helping because he had to. He was doing it because he cared deeply. One day, David decided to join James on a walk with Grandma in the garden. It was awkward at first. They didn't talk much, but the fresh air helped. James showed David how to support Grandma as she slowly walked with a cane. "She's stronger than she looks," James said. David nodded. "Yeah, she is." Over time, David began to open up. He asked James questions about caring for Grandma, how to prepare her meals, and what to watch for when she was feeling weak. James was happy to teach. He saw David's efforts and knew things were changing. One evening after dinner, David helped clear the table. James smiled and said, "I'm proud of you." David smiled back, feeling warmth he hadn't expected. The house was no longer filled with cold silence. Instead, small moments of connection and understanding were growing. Grandma, too, seemed happier. She often told stories from her past, sharing memories that made them all laugh or sometimes tear up. David realized that family wasn't about perfect moments but about being there through the hard times. And James was proof of that. As the days passed, the bond between David and James grew stronger. It wasn't easy and old feelings didn't disappear overnight, but they were learning to trust and respect each other. The house felt more like home. The mornings in the house began to feel a little brighter. Grandma's health was better, and she was able to sit up in her chair for longer periods. James continued his careful routine, helping her with everything she needed. David was also trying his best to be more involved. One day, James and David were in the kitchen preparing food for Grandma. David was chopping vegetables while James stirred the pot on the stove. The air smelled warm and comforting. "You're getting better at this," James said with a smile. David smiled back but didn't say much. He was still learning but wanted to help. As they worked together, David asked, "How did you learn to be so patient with Grandma?" James looked thoughtful. "I think it's about love. When you care for someone, patience comes naturally." David nodded slowly. "I want to be like that." James put down the spoon and looked at David. "You already are, in your own way." Later that afternoon, Grandma wanted to go outside for some fresh air. James helped her put on her coat while David opened the door. They walked slowly to the garden. The sun was warm, and birds were singing. Grandma smiled as she looked around. "This is nice," she said softly. James and David stood on either side of her, steadying her steps. David felt a strange sense of peace. He looked at James and realized how much this man had done for his family. "Thank you," David said quietly. James smiled but didn't say anything. The words were enough. That evening after dinner, David sat with James in the living room. The TV was on, but they didn't watch much. David asked, "Do you think things will get better between us?" James looked at him kindly. "I believe they already are. It takes time, but we're on the right path." David smiled, feeling hopeful. Over the next few days, David started to take more responsibility. He reminded Grandma to take her medicine, helped James clean the house, and even read stories to Grandma. James noticed these changes and felt proud. One morning, Grandma called David to her room. "You've come a long way," she said with a weak smile. David felt warmth in his heart. "I'm trying." James joined them and said, "We're all trying, together." The house was changing. The coldness and tension were fading. What was left was care, respect, and slowly growing love. David knew the journey wasn't over, but he was ready to walk it with James and Grandma. He had learned that family was not about who you were born to, but who stood by you when it mattered most. And James had stood by them always. The house felt different now. The tension that once filled the rooms had mostly gone. David and James were learning to live together in a way that felt more natural. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. One afternoon, David was sitting near Grandma's chair, reading a book aloud. Grandma's eyes were half closed, resting but comforted by his voice. James was in the kitchen, preparing tea. Suddenly, Grandma opened her eyes and looked at David. "Thank you," she said softly. "You've been good to me." David smiled but felt a little shy. "I'm trying." James came in with the tea and placed the tray on the table. "Family tries for each other," he said quietly. David looked at James differently now. He saw the man not just as someone who cared for Grandma, but as someone who had become part of their lives. Later that evening, David found himself alone with James in the living room. They sat in silence for a moment before David spoke. "I want to say sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't understand you before. I thought you didn't belong here." James looked surprised but smiled kindly. "Thank you, David. That means a lot." David nodded. "You've done so much for Grandma. And for us." James shook his head. "It's not about thanks. It's about family." The next few days brought small changes. David helped James with chores and even took Grandma for short walks outside. He noticed how James always stayed calm, even when things were hard. One afternoon, David asked James, "How do you stay so strong?" James looked thoughtful. "Sometimes you just have to be, for those who need you." David thought about those words. He realized that James had been strong not just for Grandma, but for the whole family. Grandma's health continued to improve, and with it, the atmosphere in the house grew lighter. Laughter returned in small ways, and the silence was no longer uncomfortable. One evening, David and James were talking quietly when Grandma called them to her side. "You both have done so much," she said, her voice weak, but full of warmth. "I'm thankful." David looked at James, feeling a deep respect. He finally understood what family really meant. The journey wasn't over, but the hardest part had passed. They were healing together. James smiled at David. "We're family now." David smiled back, knowing he finally believed it. Grandma's health was much better now. She could sit up in her chair without help and even smile more often. James and David had worked hard together to care for her. The house felt warmer and more peaceful than before. One morning, David woke up early. He saw James already making breakfast in the kitchen. The smell of toast and coffee filled the air. David walked in and said quietly, "Thank you for everything, James." James smiled. "You don't have to thank me. We're family." David thought about those words. They felt true now. James had become more than just a caretaker. He was part of their lives, part of their family. Later that day, Grandma wanted to share a story from her past. She sat in her chair with James and David close by. Her voice was soft but clear. "Family isn't always easy," Grandma said, "but love makes it worth it." David listened carefully. He felt grateful for the lessons he had learned. James looked at David and said, "We've all grown a lot. The hard times brought us closer." David nodded. "I'm sorry for the things I said before. I didn't understand." James shook his head. "It's okay. What matters is now." The days that followed were filled with small moments of happiness. David helped James in the garden, and sometimes they cooked together. Grandma watched them with a smile. One evening, David sat with James and said, "I'm glad you stayed. You made this house a home." James looked tired but happy. "And I'm glad to be here." As the sun set, the family sat together. The past difficulties felt far away. What mattered was the love and care they shared now. David realized that family wasn't about blood or skin color. It was about being there for each other when it counted. And James had shown him what that truly meant. The house was no longer just a building. It was a place filled with hope, healing, and family. They were moving forward together,